Big Shaq thought he was just standing by a grieving widow, until a funeral proposal shattered everything. A missing will, a poisoned drink, a brother's betrayal. As family secrets spiral into scandal, Shaq faces a storm of racism, power, and deception. In a world where the law looks the other way, can one man's loyalty expose the truth? At her husband's funeral, his brother proposed, but then she found a letter that changed everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to a channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The heat pressed gently on the backs of the mourners, the sun casting long shadows over the manicured cemetery lawn. Rows of black folding chairs lined the green turf, filled with elegantly dressed guests who wore grief like a fashion accessory, subtle, tasteful, and coordinated. A low hush floated above the gathering like mist. Only the occasional sniffle or shuffle of a shoe broke through. They had come to say goodbye to Jasper Westfield, and they did it the way the Westfield family always did things: quiet, polished, and under control. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the back, his towering presence both grounding and unmissable, even in silence. Dressed in a tailored black suit, hands folded in front of him, he didn't move much. He didn't need to. He was there for Clara, not for show, not for spectacle, just there. Because when a woman buries the man she thought she'd grow old with, she doesn't need noise. She needs someone solid. And Shaq had always been solid. Clara sat in the front row, veil slightly lifted, her face pale but proud. She hadn't cried, not openly. Her lips trembled once when the pastor said Jasper's name, and her fingers clenched around the folded tissue in her lap. But her spine never bent, not even when the casket was lower, not even when the soil hit wood. But Shaq noticed everything. He noticed how Silas Westfield didn't keep his eyes on the casket. His gaze, piercing and off-kilter, stayed fixed on Clara, not out of brotherly grief or family solidarity. No, it was something else entirely. Something territorial, something expectant. Shaq shifted slightly, arms folding over his chest, and scanned the faces surrounding him. Most didn't look his way, some did, and quickly looked away. He could feel the undercurrent, the same one he'd felt walking into the Westfield estate the first time Clara invited him to dinner. He was successful, beloved and known. But here in this zip code among this circle, he was still a question mark, still the other. It wasn't spoken, not in words, but it didn't need to be. The ceremony continued, with carefully selected speakers sharing memories of Jasper. His business partner praised his leadership. A cousin recited a childhood memory. His college friend cracked a dry joke that earned a few polite laughs. But none of it felt real. None of it touched the raw edge of grief. It was all packaged loss, curated mourning. Only Clara's silence was honest. Shaq's thoughts drifted back to the last time he saw Jasper, 3 weeks before the accident. They'd played a quiet round of golf, as they often did, talking more about life than swings. Jasper had seemed uneasy that day, distracted. He'd paused mid-conversation and stared out over the water, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't. When Shaq asked him if everything was all right, Jasper only smiled and said, "Some things don't feel right anymore, but I'm working on it." Now, standing at his grave, Shaq wished he'd pushed harder. The final prayer was said. People rose, straightened their coats and ties, exchanged nods, and slowly drifted toward the parked cars, lined along the winding cemetery road. Small talk crept in like smoke, quiet condolences, and tightly rehearsed sympathy. Clara stood alone now, and turned away from the crowd. Shaq moved toward her. He didn't speak, just placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. "I'm okay," she whispered. He didn't believe her, but he nodded. "I'm glad you came, Shaq," she said softly, looking straight ahead. "You were his real friend. He always said that." "Still is," Shaq replied, voice low, steady. "He still is." For a moment the two just stood there side by side, while the world moved around them. The wind shifted slightly. A petal from one of the nearby bouquets drifted across Clara's shoe. Then, behind them, a new voice broke the stillness. "Clara." Shaq turned first. Silas Westfield approached, his stride confident, his face arranged into something too practiced to be genuine. He was dressed sharply, of course, but there was a stiffness in his collar, like he was wearing the grief rather than feeling it. Silas started, then paused dramatically. "I've been thinking a lot these past few days, about Jasper, about you." Clara's expression remained unreadable. "We've known each other a long time," Silas continued, eyes flicking to Shaq and back. And maybe now isn't the right moment. But I can't. I won't wait anymore. Shaq tensed. Silas reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small velvet box. He opened it. Gasps echoed from the few guests still lingering nearby. Someone audibly whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." Shaq's jaw clenched. Clara's eyes widened, not in joy, not in disbelief, but in something that looked like horror. "I want to do what Jasper would have wanted," Silas said, tone absurdly smooth. "Take care of you. Be there for you. You've always deserved." "Stop," Clara's voice cracked out, barely above a breath, but it sliced through the air like a blade. Silas paused. "I'm not doing this," she said, turning away. Shaq stepped forward, placing himself gently between them. His eyes never left Silas's. "This isn't the time," Shaq said, voice measured, like a storm banked behind still water. Silas looked up at him, something bitter swimming just behind his pupils. "You don't get to decide that," he muttered. "No," Shaq replied calmly. "But neither do you." Silas scoffed and turned, slipping the ring back into his pocket with a rustle of fabric and pride. Without another word, he walked off toward the parking lot, drawing a trail of scandalized murmurs behind him. Shaq turned to Clara. Her hand was trembling. He didn't comment, just offered his arm. She took it. As they walked back toward the car, Shaq could feel it, the whisper beneath the funeral surface. Something deeper. Something wrong. Because no brother proposes at a funeral unless he's hiding something. And no woman walks away from a ring with that much fear in her eyes. Unless she already knows the answer. The funeral was over, but the story was just beginning. The sun was beginning to slip toward the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the cemetery as the funeral crowd began to drift apart, their black coats and somber hats scattered like chess pieces across the grass. Shaquille O'Neal remained near Clara, his broad frame a quiet wall of support. He watched, observing every glance, every whisper, as the guests carefully navigated the delicate post-funeral etiquette, offering condolences, making swift exits, avoiding prolonged eye contact. But even in this delicate dance, one figure moved differently. Silas Westfield cut through the crowd like a man who didn't belong in grief. His posture was too straight, his steps too sure. Shaq watched his approach, feeling a cold stir beneath his ribs. Clara, still pale and visibly shaken, hadn't noticed him yet, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the graveyard, where the sky began to bruise with early dusk. Shaq leaned slightly, readying himself. He didn't know why, but something deep inside told him to stay close. Without a word, Silas stepped in front of Clara. His shadow fell over her, blocking out the last flicker of light. She blinked, startled, her lips parting slightly, as if to ask what he wanted. But before the words could form, Silas was already moving. In one practiced motion, he slipped his hand into his pocket, dropped smoothly to one knee, and opened a small velvet box. The world seemed to pause. Gasps rippled through the thinning crowd. A woman near the edge of the lawn clutched her pearls. A man whispered something sharp to his wife. Heads turned, eyes widened, but no one stepped forward. Only Shaq, towering behind Clara, felt his stomach twist into a knot. "Clara," Silas said, his voice just loud enough to carry, smooth and polished like everything else about him. "I know this is sudden, but I can't stand here another day pretending I don't feel what I feel." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide, body frozen. "We've both lost Jasper," Silas continued, his tone dipping into something almost rehearsed, "and I can't pretend that hasn't changed everything. I've loved you quietly, maybe, but truly for years. And I know you're hurting, but I want to be the one to help heal you." Shaq's fists tightened slowly at his sides, the weight of this surreal moment pressing hard against his chest. His protective instincts roared awake. He couldn't fathom what kind of man proposed at his own brother's funeral, but he knew one thing: it wasn't a man acting out of love. Clara staggered back a half step, visibly trembling. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Her eyes darted quickly, searching Shaq thought for an escape. Silas rose smoothly, slipping the box back into his pocket, his jaw tightening for just a flicker before smoothing back into that composed, unflappable mask. He shot Shaq a brief, dismissive glance, one that said, "This doesn't concern you." But Shaq didn't step aside. Instead, he shifted slightly forward, an unmistakable signal of presence, not aggression, just steady, immovable presence. Clara turned, pressing her palm against Shaq's arm, her fingers gripped tightly, anchoring herself. Shaq looked down at her, met her panicked eyes, and gave the faintest nod. His message was clear: I've got you. Around them, the crowd thickened with murmurs. The whispers weren't just about the proposal. They were about Clara, about Shaq, about race, about power. Shaq heard snippets, caught in the air like falling ash. Did you see that? Poor Jasper. Barely in the ground. Silas was always the stronger brother. Anyway. And Shaq? What's he doing in the middle of this? The undercurrent was unmistakable. Old money, old power, old prejudice, curling through the voices like smoke. Silas leaned in slightly, his expression cool, lips pressed into a thin line. Clara, think about this carefully. You're alone now. You need someone who understands this world, who can protect you. Shaq saw Clara flinch, saw the tension in her shoulders, and something inside him bristled, not with anger but with a fierce clarity. Silas wasn't just making a romantic play, he was making a claim. This wasn't about love. This was about control, about keeping the family's image tidy, about folding Clara back into a shape that fit the Westfield legacy. I think we're done here, Silas, Shaq said softly, his deep voice cutting through the space without needing to rise. It wasn't a threat. It was a line drawn. Silas's eyes flicked to him sharply, irritation flashing just beneath the surface. For a moment, the two men held each other's gaze, the wealthy, sharp-edged brother, and the towering, grounded outsider. Then, with a sharp exhale, Silas straightened his coat and offered Clara a final, thin smile. I'll give you time, he said, voice clipped. But don't wait too long. With that, he turned and strode away, cutting across the lawn, leaving the murmuring crowd and a stunned widow behind. Clara sagged slightly, the tension draining from her legs. Shaq shifted to support her, one large hand steadying her elbow. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then, with a shaky breath, she whispered, Did you know he felt that way? Shaq shook his head gently. Not like that. Clara closed her eyes, pulling in a shaky breath. I can't do this, Shaq. I can't navigate this world alone. You're not alone, Shaq said quietly. She let out a fragile laugh, one that cracked at the edges. You don't understand, Shaq. There are things I can't even explain. Shaq frowned, his protective instincts sharpening. What things? She glanced up at him, her eyes haunted. Jasper. He left me something. A letter. I found it tucked under his pillow last night. It's not just grief, Shaq. There's something wrong. He was afraid. Shaq's pulse kicked up. Afraid of what? Clara's fingers trembled against his sleeve. He didn't say exactly, but he was worried about Silas, about the family, about what comes next. Shaq's mind worked quickly, connecting threads, sensing the weight of what Clara wasn't yet ready to voice. Whatever Jasper had feared, it hadn't died with him. It was still here, wrapping itself around Clara, around the estate, around the future she now faced alone. As they moved quietly toward the cars, Shaq cast one final glance back at the casket, now partly covered with soil. His jaw tightened, and a silent promise settled heavy in his chest. He would not let this woman be swallowed by the Westfield machine. He would not let old money, old secrets, or old prejudice decide how the story ended. Something was wrong. And Shaq was going to find out what. The Westfield mansion stood like a quiet fortress against the night sky, its windows glowing faintly behind layers of heavy drapery. Inside, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her trembling hands clutching a single sheet of paper. Her room, though grand and meticulously arranged, felt suffocating. The walls seemed to lean in, the shadows seemed longer than they should, and the silence felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She hadn't planned to call Shaq, but when she found the letter folded neatly and tucked beneath Jasper's pillow, her hands shook so badly she couldn't dial anyone else. She needed someone who wasn't tangled in the family's lies, someone she could trust. She needed When Shaq arrived, Clara let him in without a word. He stepped inside, his large presence somehow gentle in the dim hallway, the sound of his polished shoes muffled by the thick carpet. He followed her upstairs, noticing how her shoulders curled inward, how her steps faltered like she was walking through invisible cobwebs. When they reached her room, Clara handed him the letter with eyes still damp from crying. I found it when I was changing the sheets, she whispered. He must have hidden it. I didn't even know he wrote anything. Shaq sat carefully in the corner armchair, unfolding the paper with his large hands, feeling the fine texture of expensive stationery, but noticing the rushed, uneven script that covered it. This wasn't a formal letter. This was something Jasper had written quickly, maybe in fear, maybe in panic. He read silently, Clara's eyes fixed on him, searching his face for a reaction. Jasper's words flowed in messy strokes. Clara, if you're reading this, something's happened to me. I don't trust Silas. I know that sounds harsh, but I need you to hear me. He's been talking to father behind my back. He's been visiting the lawyers. I think he's trying to push me out, take everything. I've changed the will. It's hidden in the study, behind the second bookshelf, the one with the green spine. Please, Clara, please don't let him erase me. Don't trust him. Not with the house, not with the company, not with your heart. I love you. Please be careful. Shaq let the letter sink in for a moment, the weight of Jasper's fear hanging in the room like an extra presence. Clara wrapped her arms tightly around herself, shaking her head softly. He never told me any of this, she whispered. Why didn't he tell me? Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Because he was scared. He probably didn't know who to trust. Maybe he was trying to protect you. Clara's breath hitched, and she wiped at her cheeks with trembling fingers. I thought we were happy, Shaq. I thought we were strong. But now, I don't even know what was real. Shaq's gaze softened, but his mind worked sharply. Silas, the will, the betrayal. It all lined up too neatly, like a puzzle where the final pieces had been hidden until just now. He realized Jasper had seen the betrayal coming, had tried to shield Clara from it, but had been stopped before he could act. Have you checked the study yet? Shaq asked quietly. Clara shook her head. I couldn't. I was too scared. What if it's not there? What if I'm just chasing ghosts? Shaq stood, his massive frame filling the room with a quiet determination. Then let's go look. They walked together down the long, echoing hallway, past polished family portraits and antique vases. The house felt colder at night, the silence sharper, like it was waiting. In the study, the fireplace sat cold and unused. Books lined the walls, floor to ceiling, their spines gleaming under the low light. Clara hovered near the door, her hands twisting in front of her. Shaq approached the shelves, scanning quickly. He found the second bookshelf, the one Jasper had mentioned, and ran his fingers along the row until he found the green spine. Carefully, he pulled the book out, and just behind it, tucked in the narrow space between wood and wall, was a manila envelope. Clara let out a shaky breath, covering her mouth with both hands. Shaq opened the envelope, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the documents inside. It was Jasper's will, all right, rewritten, notarized, and dated just 3 weeks before his death. The signatures were all there, the revisions were clear. Clara inherited everything. Silas was explicitly removed. Shaq's stomach tightened. Jasper had known what was coming. Clara's voice trembled as she asked, "What do we do now?" Shaq turned to her, his eyes steady. "We protect this. We protect you." She let out a shaky laugh, somewhere between relief and panic. "I can't believe this. I can't believe he was planning all of this behind Silas's back. Do you think Silas knows?" Shaq's jaw tightened. "I think he suspects. That's why he's moving so fast." Clara sank onto the edge of a nearby chair, her hands trembling against her lap. "I don't know if I can fight him, Shaq. He's got the family, the lawyers, the board. I'm just..." Shaq crouched slightly, bringing himself to her level. "You're not just you. You're Jasper's wife. You're the person he trusted most. And you're not alone." Clara's eyes shimmered with fresh tears. "Why are you helping me? You don't have to. You could walk away from all of this." Shaq's face softened, but his voice remained grounded. "Because I don't walk away from people I care about. And because this isn't just about money or power, it's about what's right." The room fell into a heavy silence. Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then we fight." Shaq gave a small, approving nod. "We fight." They spent the next hour carefully reviewing the documents, planning their next steps. Shaq's mind worked quickly, methodically, laying out what needed to happen: legal consultations, securing the will, preparing for the inevitable pushback. Clara, though still fragile, began to straighten, her spine regaining some of the quiet strength that had first drawn Jasper to her. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Shaq felt the full weight of what they were stepping into. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was a battle of legacy, of control, of erasing a man's final wishes. It was a fight sharpened by prejudice, by old wounds, by the unspoken rules that governed families like the Westfields. When he finally left the house, the air outside was cold and sharp, but Shaq's mind burned hot with determination. He looked back once, seeing Clara's silhouette framed in the window, watching him go. As he climbed into his car, Shaq felt it settle fully into his bones. This was no ordinary grief. This was a mystery, wrapped in betrayal, demanding answers. And he was ready to find them. The Westfield estate sat high on the hill, an imposing sprawl of brick and stone, its towering columns and manicured lawns designed to project old wealth and ironclad control. Shaq drove up the winding drive, his fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel. As the mansion came into full view, this was enemy territory now, and he knew it. The Westfields might have smiled at him at charity galas and family barbecues, but underneath the cracks had always been there. Hairline fractures and civility, the subtle condescensions, the lingering glances, the reminders that in their world, he was always a guest, never a fixture. He parked near the front entrance, drawing a few suspicious glances from the house staff, who hovered near the stone archways. Shaq nodded politely, but kept his focus sharp. Today, he was here for one person, Harland Westfield, Jasper and Silas's father, the patriarch, the final word in the Westfield legacy. Harland was a man of immense influence, and even more immense prejudice, a man whose handshake was firm but whose compliments were laced with barbs. Shaq had dealt with him before, always careful, always respectful, but today respect had limits. He was led through the main hall by a tight-lipped butler, the marble floors echoing with each heavy footstep. The walls were lined with portraits, stern-faced ancestors, none smiling, all gazing down with the kind of cold authority that sent a chill even through Shaq's broad shoulders. Finally, they reached Harland's study, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, Harland sat in a large leather chair, an aged but formidable figure with silver hair perfectly combed back, dressed sharply in a vest and pressed shirt despite the late hour. He looked up as Shaq entered, a slow smirk curling onto his face. "Well, well," Harland drawled, his voice gravelly with age, but edged with sharpness. "If it isn't the basketball star, come to play detective in my house." Shaq stepped forward calmly, hands at his sides. "I'm here because Clara needs answers. Jasper deserved better than what's happening now." Harland chuckled, leaning back. "Oh, son, you're out of your depth. This is family business. You don't belong in it." Shaq felt the old sting of that word, belong, but he kept his voice steady. "Jasper was my friend. That's my business." Harland's smile faded slightly. "Let me tell you something, O'Neill. Jasper was a good boy, but he was soft. He let his heart lead him into places it shouldn't have gone. That marriage," Harland waved a dismissive hand, "was a mistake from the start. He should have known better. We all did." Shaq's jaw tightened, but he stayed planted. "Clara is his widow. She's the legal heir. Silas proposing at the funeral, maneuvering behind her back. That's not grief. That's ambition." Harland's eyes flashed coldly. "Silas understands how things work. He knows what it takes to keep the family name intact. Jasper was too distracted, too tangled up in things that didn't serve the family's future." Shaq's patience thinned, but he knew better than to snap. "You mean his marriage?" Harland gave a thin, satisfied smile. "I mean everything." Without another word, Shaq turned on his heel and left the room, ignoring the old man's faint chuckle as it followed him down the hallway. He didn't need more from Harland. He'd gotten what he came for. The confirmation. Harland wasn't neutral in this. He'd always seen Clara as a threat, not family, and Silas had been handed the quiet blessing to fix that mistake. Outside the study, Shaq moved deeper into the mansion, seeking out the few people who saw everything but were rarely asked. The staff. He knew most of them by face, if not by name. The housekeeper, the groundskeeper, the driver. Over the years, they'd watched the Westfields up close, seen the real family dynamics behind the polished social fronts. In the kitchen, he found Lorraine, the longtime housekeeper, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a weary posture. She was wiping down the counter when she saw Shaq, pausing with a wary glance. "Lorraine," Shaq said gently, "I need to ask you something." She looked around, then lowered her voice. "I shouldn't be talking to you about them, Mr. O'Neill. I'm not asking you to betray anyone," Shaq assured her. "Just to tell me what you've seen." Lorraine hesitated, then sighed. "Mr. Silas. He's always been the one with the temper. He doesn't like being second. Hated when Jasper got the company. Hated when Jasper married Clara. Said things in the house. Things no one should have said, especially about her. Shaq frowned. What kind of things? Lorraine's mouth pressed tight. Things about how she didn't belong. How she was just a phase. How Jasper would come to his senses. But Jasper didn't. He loved her. And that made Silas angry. In ways I've never seen. Shaq exhaled slowly, the pieces locking into place. You think Silas wanted Clara out of the picture? Lorraine's eyes flicked nervously toward the hallway. I don't know what he wanted, but I know what he didn't want. He didn't want her sitting at the head of the table. Shaq thanked her quietly, his mind churning as he stepped back into the cool evening air. The sky was dark now, stars pricking the horizon. As he crossed the courtyard, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Clara. I can't sleep, she said, when he answered, her voice small, strained. I keep thinking about the letter, about what Jasper was trying to tell me. I'm scared, Shaq. What if Silas knows we found the will? Shaq's voice softened. Then we stay one step ahead. I talked to the staff. Silas has been angry for a long time. This isn't just about money, it's about erasing you. Making sure you don't get to carry Jasper's place forward. Clara's breath hitched. He always hated me, didn't he? Shaq closed his eyes briefly. I think he hated what you represented. Change. Jasper choosing love over tradition. On the other end of the line, Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, voice trembling but clear, I won't let him erase Jasper. I won't let him erase me. Shaq felt a fierce swell of respect. Good, because I'm not letting him either. As he ended the call, Shaq stood under the cold stars, feeling the weight of everything closing in. Harlan's dismissive smile, Silas's greedy maneuvering, the staff's quiet warnings, it all pointed to a family where loyalty was a weapon, and love was weakness. This wasn't just a legal battle, this was a moral one. And Shaq knew he'd have to fight it carefully, strategically, and with every ounce of quiet strength he had. The Westfields were circling their wagons. But Shaq wasn't about to back down. The next morning, Shaq sat quietly in his car, outside the office of Benjamin Hawthorne, Jasper's longtime lawyer. The building was old brick, tucked on a narrow street just off the main downtown square, its sign slightly weathered, but its reputation sharp. Shaq exhaled, bracing himself. He wasn't just here for legal facts, he was here for the threads Jasper had left behind, the ones Clara couldn't pull on, without tearing open every wound she was trying to hold closed. Inside, the office smelled of old books and polished wood, the air cool and heavy. Benjamin Hawthorne stood when Shaq entered. A thin man in his 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and a reputation for discretion. He extended a hand politely, his grip firm but hesitant, as if already sensing this meeting was no routine visit. Mr. O'Neill, Hawthorne said quietly, gesturing Shaq to sit. I assume you're here about Jasper. Shaq settled into the leather chair, his broad shoulders taking up more space than the chair was meant to hold. I need to know the truth, Mr. Hawthorne. Did Jasper change his will? The lawyer's expression shifted slightly, not surprise but a flicker of discomfort. He leaned back, folding his hands carefully on the desk. Yes, he said, after a beat. Jasper rewrote his will 3 weeks before his death. I drew it up myself. Shaq's heart thudded. And what did it say? Hawthorne hesitated, then spoke carefully. It left everything. The estate, the company shares, the properties to Clara. Silas was removed entirely. Shaq exhaled slowly, absorbing the blow. It was one thing to suspect, but hearing it confirmed sent a pulse of urgency through his chest. Where's the document now? Hawthorne's face tightened. That's the problem. Jasper took the signed original with him, intending to file it with the family records himself. I kept a digital copy, but when I went to access it after his death, the file was gone. Wiped from the system. My backups were corrupted. Shaq leaned forward, his voice low and measured. You think someone sabotaged it? The lawyer gave a tight, grim smile. In my line of work, I don't deal in accusations. But I know when something doesn't add up. Shaq's mind raced. Silas had known, or at least he'd suspected. Jasper had seen the threat coming and tried to cut him out before it was too late. But somehow Silas or someone close to him had gotten ahead of the game. And now, without the official will, Clara stood vulnerable, just as Jasper had feared. As Shaq left the office, the gravity of the situation pressed hard against his chest. The Westfields weren't just a grieving family. They were a family on the edge of a power shift, desperate to bury anything that threatened their grip on wealth and legacy. He knew Silas wouldn't stop at subtle manipulation or whispered proposals. There was something darker moving beneath the surface, something Jasper had seen too late. By the time Shaq reached Clara's house, she was pacing the living room, her hands running anxiously through her hair. She spun around the moment he stepped inside. "What did he say? Did you find anything?" Shaq closed the door carefully, stepping toward her. "There was a new will, Clara. Jasper left everything to you." Silas was cut out. Clara let out a shaky breath, collapsing onto the couch. "Then why? Why hasn't anyone mentioned it? Why does everyone act like Silas is the rightful heir?" "Because the original is missing," Shaq said quietly, sinking onto the armrest beside her. "And the lawyer's copies were sabotaged. Someone made sure that will never saw daylight." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God. Jasper knew. He knew they'd come after me." Shaq reached out, steadying her trembling hands. "He tried to protect you, Clara, and now we have to finish what he started." But even as he spoke the words, Shaq felt the heavy truth settle in. They were up against more than just family squabbles or legal maneuvers. They were up against a machine, old wealth, old connections, and a network of influence that knew how to cover its tracks. He could already hear the whispered warnings in his mind. "You're meddling where you don't belong, Shaq. Stay out of Westfield business." But Shaq had never been good at walking away from people who needed him. That afternoon he reached out quietly to Louis Donahue, a friend in the local legal circles, someone sharp and discreet. Over coffee in a quiet corner of the cafe, Shaq laid out the situation, watching as Louis's brow furrowed deeper with each detail. "You're sitting on a legal powder keg," Louis muttered, stirring his coffee absently. "Without the original will or a certified copy, you're looking at a contested estate. And if the Westfields want to fight, they've got the resources to drag this through the courts, until Clara gives up." Shaq's jaw tightened. "She's not giving up. Neither am I." Louis gave him a wary look. "You sure you want to tangle with these people, Shaq? They don't play fair." "I'm sure," Shaq said quietly. By the time Shaq returned to Clara's that evening, she was standing at the window, staring out at the darkened lawn. The mansion's silhouette loomed on the horizon, its windows glowing faintly. Shaq crossed the room, standing beside her. "They're going to come hard, Clara," he said softly. "They'll make you doubt yourself. They'll make you think you're alone." Clara turned, her face pale but set with quiet determination. "I'm not alone." Shaq gave a small, tight nod. "No, you're not." For a long moment, they stood there together, two figures silhouetted against the night, staring down the weight of everything they were about to face. Shaq felt the old tension coil in his chest, the tension of knowing the fight wasn't just about paperwork or signatures. It was about erasing a love that had defied expectations, about punishing a woman for daring to belong where the old rules said she didn't. And Shaq wasn't about to let them win. He stayed late into the night, helping Clara secure the documents they did have, making calls, drafting lists of what they'd need next. As the hours slipped past midnight, Shaq felt the fatigue settle into his bones. But he didn't leave. Not yet. Not until he was sure Clara felt steadier. Finally, when he rose to go, Clara walked him to the door, her eyes tired but grateful. "Thank you, Shaq," she whispered. "I don't know how I'm going to get through this." Shaq gave her a small, quiet smile, one step at a time. As he stepped out into the cold night air, Shaq exhaled, watching his breath cloud in front of him. He glanced back once, seeing Clara standing in the doorway, her figure small but unbowed. The will had vanished. The family was circling its wagons. But Shaq knew one thing. They hadn't counted on him. And he was just getting started. The echo of a basketball striking asphalt filled the quiet court, its rhythmic bounce steady under Shaq's large hand. This was where he came when his mind wouldn't stop racing, when the weight on his chest pressed too hard. Under the open sky, with the cool night breeze brushing against his skin, he could breathe, or at least try. The downtown lights glittered faintly beyond the fence, the sounds of the city muffled in the distance. Shaq focused on the ball, dribbling, pivoting, running plays in his mind, not for sport but for clarity. He wasn't just a former NBA legend here. He was a man trying to untangle knots too tight to ignore. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Clara. Just a simple thank you. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. That woman had been thrown into a storm she never saw coming, and yet she still found space to thank the person pulling her into the eye of it. Shaq shot the ball, watched it arc cleanly through the hoop, then caught it again on the rebound, letting the familiar motion settle his nerves. "Never figured I'd find you here." The voice came from the shadows, rough around the edges. A little hoarse, a little too casual. Shaq turned, squinting through the dim light, until the figure stepped forward. Dean Harper, an old acquaintance, someone from Jasper's business circles, but not quite an inner circle man. Dean was the type who hovered around money, the kind of guy who always knew more than he was supposed to. Shaq raised a brow. "Dean, what brings you out?" Dean gave a half shrug, stepping onto the court with hands tucked deep into his jacket pockets. "Heard you've been asking questions. Figured I'd save you a little time." Shaq watched him carefully, dribbling the ball slowly under one hand. "I'm listening." Dean exhaled sharply, eyes flicking around as if to check for ghosts. "Look, I don't want to get in the middle of Westfield business. They play rough. You know that. But Jasper, he wasn't just worried about his will, Shaq. He was worried about his life." Shaq's hand stilled on the ball. "Go on." Dean glanced away, swallowing hard. "We had drinks a few weeks before the accident. Jasper was jittery, more than usual. Kept talking in circles. Said he felt like someone was watching him. Said Silas was pressing hard, poking into his finances, pushing him out of certain deals, and then, Dean lowered his voice. He said something that stuck with me. He said if anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." Shaq's pulse kicked up, his mouth dry. What was he afraid of? Dean rubbed a hand over his mouth. He hinted, not directly, but he said he thought someone had tampered with his drinks. That maybe someone was trying to slow him down, wear him out. He was going to get tests done, check his blood, but I don't know if he ever followed through. Shaq's heart pounded. "You're saying Jasper thought he was being poisoned?" Dean lifted both hands in a helpless gesture. "I'm saying Jasper didn't think his time was running out naturally." For a long moment Shaq stood still, the ball forgotten at his side, his mind racing through every conversation, every glance, every warning he'd ignored. Jasper's distracted mood at the golf course, the letter tucked under the pillow, the rewritten will. None of this was just business maneuvering. This was a setup, a trap, a plan that had been unfolding in shadows while everyone else looked the other way. "Why are you telling me this now?" Shaq asked quietly. Dean gave a crooked, tired smile. "Because you're the only one who might actually do something about it." Shaq's throat tightened, emotions crashing hard against his chest. He'd already felt the pressure of grief, the sting of betrayal, but now there was a darker current pulling at him. The realization that Jasper's death hadn't just been a loss. It might have been a murder. He left the court not long after, driving through the silent streets, his thoughts heavy, sharp, relentless. By the time he reached Clara's house, he was burning with urgency. But he forced himself to calm, to steady his breath. He didn't want to rattle her, not more than she already was. Inside, Clara was curled on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, eyes red-rimmed but wide awake. She sat up quickly when she saw Shaq, her expression tense. "What is it? What happened?" Shaq sank into the armchair across from her, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I talked to someone tonight. Someone Jasper confided in." Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. "And?" Shaq's voice was low, steady. "Jasper thought someone was poisoning him." Clara, her breath caught audibly, a sharp intake of air as her face drained pale. "No. No, Shaq. That can't be." "He told people," Shaq continued softly. "He was scared. He knew Silas was pushing hard, and he knew the will would be a blow. But this wasn't just business. He thought someone wanted him gone." Clara shook her head slowly, eyes filling with fresh tears. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he warn me?" Shaq reached across, his hand covering hers gently. "Maybe he was trying to protect you. Maybe he thought he could handle it himself." Clara let out a shaky breath, her voice breaking. "I keep thinking about the night he died, Shaq. He didn't feel well. He said he was just tired, just overworked. But what if?" Shaq's grip tightened slightly. "We don't know yet, but we're going to find out." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, the night pressing in cold and sharp. Shaq sat back, exhaling slowly, his mind already running ahead. Who could they trust? What steps could they take? How far would Silas go to keep the truth buried? He could already hear the whispers in the corners, the muttered accusations, the dismissive shrugs. Shaq's just the help, they'd say. Shaq's meddling where he doesn't belong. But he didn't care. He'd stood on bigger stages than this, faced down bigger odds. And this was personal. He looked at Clara, saw the fear flicker behind her exhaustion, saw the quiet steel beginning to surface. She wasn't going to break. Neither was he. This isn't over, Shaq said softly, almost to himself. Clara looked up, her voice barely a whisper. Promise me, Shaq. Promise me you won't let them win. Shaq's gaze locked with hers, his voice low, firm, unshakable. I promise. As the night deepened, Shaq felt the weight of the fight ahead settle fully onto his shoulders. But he also felt the old, familiar surge of purpose rise in his chest. They wanted this buried. He was going to dig it up. The house was unusually still when Shaq arrived that evening. The kind of silence that doesn't just come from an empty room, but from a soul that has been hollowed out. Clara stood at the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shoulders hunched as though she could hold her unraveling world together with sheer will. The fire in the hearth flickered low, casting long, uncertain shadows across the room. Shaq stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. His heart was heavy, the weight of what he'd uncovered, pressing down harder than he expected. He didn't know how to begin. Every step he'd taken so far had been about protecting Clara, about untangling Jasper's death. But now the lines were blurring. He cleared his throat softly. Clara, we need to talk. She turned slowly, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her face pale. She looked at him not like a woman waiting for answers, but like someone waiting for a verdict she already feared. I know, she whispered. Shaq's brow furrowed. I spoke to someone, Clara. Someone Jasper trusted. He thought he was being poisoned. He was avoiding drinks, meals. He knew something was off. Clara closed her eyes, her breath shuddering out in one long, painful exhale. I know. The admission hit Shaq like a gut punch. He stepped closer, his voice tightening. You knew. She opened her eyes again, and for a moment Shaq saw something raw, something almost broken behind them. The night Jasper died, he was supposed to go to a dinner, a family thing. Silas brought him a drink, one Jasper always liked. But Jasper didn't drink it. He set it down, said he was too tired. Later when I found it still sitting there, she broke off, her voice trembling. Shaq's fists clenched loosely at his sides. Why didn't you tell me this before? Clara let out a shaky laugh, half bitter, half grief-stricken. Because I didn't know what to do with it. Because part of me didn't want to believe it. And, her voice cracked again, because there's more. Shaq felt his chest tighten, a cold knot twisting deep in his stomach. More? Clara sank onto the edge of the couch, burying her face in her hands before looking up at him, her eyes shimmering with guilt. Before Jasper and I were married, I made a mistake. I was briefly involved with Silas. The room seemed to tilt, the words hanging in the air like a blow that took too long to land. Shaq stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to slot this new jagged piece into the puzzle. You what? It was before Jasper and I were serious, Clara rushed on, her voice shaking. It didn't mean anything. I ended it. But Silas, he never let it go. He always had this hold, this way of reminding me. He'd make these comments, these suggestions. Jasper never knew. Shaq stepped back slightly, dragging a hand over his face. His heart pounded, a hot mix of anger, disappointment, and confusion roaring through his veins. Clara, do you understand what you're telling me? That Silas had a reason to resent both of you. That he wanted you back. That he wanted Jasper out of the picture. And you didn't tell me any of this. Clara's voice broke on a sob. I was ashamed, Shaq. I thought it was over. I thought it was in the past. And then Jasper died. And everything fell apart. And I didn't know how to hold it together without drowning in guilt. Shaq turned away, pacing the room, trying to force air into his lungs, trying to think. The betrayal wasn't just Silas's now. It was layered, tangled in personal failings, private regrets, and silent mistakes. He had walked into this fight believing Clara was an innocent widow caught in the crossfire. But now the battlefield looked different. The sides weren't as clean. The motivations weren't as pure. He stopped, turning back to her. Do you still have feelings for him? Clara shook her head quickly, desperately. No, I swear. That ended long ago. Shaq searched her face, his instincts tugging at him from all directions. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to keep fighting for her. But a part of him recoiled, stung by the realization that he had only ever seen part of the picture. "Clara, this changes everything," he said softly. "I know," her voice was small, "but I need you to believe me, Shaq. I need you to believe that I want to make this right, that I want to honor Jasper, no matter how messy this is." Shaq sank onto a nearby chair, his elbows on his knees, his head hanging for a moment, as he pulled in a deep, steadying breath. He thought about Jasper, their conversations on the golf course, the way Jasper had confided in him, the trust they'd built. He thought about Silas, the ambition, the coldness, the calculating gaze. And he thought about Clara sitting here now, raw and vulnerable, her world crumbling under the weight of past mistakes and present dangers. He lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not walking away, Clara, but you have to be honest with me from now on. No more secrets. No more half-truths. If we're going to fight this, we do it together, completely." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, a fragile, grateful sound breaking from her throat. "I swear, Shaq. No more secrets." The two sat there in the heavy quiet, the firelight flickering between them, both feeling the shift in the ground beneath their feet. They were no longer just fighting a legal battle, or chasing down a missing will. They were facing something far more complex: the human failings, the tangled histories, the emotional wreckage that surrounded Jasper's death. Shaq leaned back, his mind sharpening, his determination hardening. He couldn't afford to let personal disappointment derail him. He had stepped into this to find the truth, to stand up against injustice. And that mission hadn't changed, even if the path had become messier. As the clock struck midnight, Shaq stood, offering Clara a hand. She took it, rising unsteadily to her feet. "We're going to face this, Clara," Shaq said quietly. "No matter how ugly it gets, we're going to find the truth." Clara nodded, her grip tightening slightly. Together, Shaq gave her a small, resolute nod before turning toward the door. As he stepped outside into the cold night, the wind cut sharply against his face. But he welcomed it. He needed the clarity, the sharpness, the reminder that this wasn't just about emotions, it was about justice. He walked to his car slowly, feeling the storm gathering around him, knowing the next steps would demand everything he had: his strength, his focus, his resolve. The betrayal had unfolded. Now it was time to confront it. Head on. Shaq sat in the small wood-paneled office of the local sheriff's department, his massive frame dwarfing the delicate chair as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands steepled. Across from him, Sheriff Neil Stratton skimmed the papers Shaq had laid on the desk: copies of Jasper's rewritten will, the lawyer's affidavit, notes about the suspicious drink Jasper had refused the night he died, and the accounts Shaq had gathered from the house staff. Shaq watched Stratton closely, reading every twitch, every furrow of the brow, every deliberate pause. But as the minutes dragged on, his heart sank. He could see it. The sheriff was already shutting down. Stratton sighed, setting the papers aside carefully. "Shaquille, look, I respect you. Everyone around here does. But this is a family matter. A messy one. Sure, but not criminal. There's no toxicology report, no autopsy request, no formal complaint from the family." Shaq's jaw tightened. Jasper's dead. His will was tampered with. His wife is being pushed out. And you're telling me none of that raises red flags? Stratton's mouth twisted slightly, a mix of sympathy and calculation. "I'm telling you, the Westfields are one of the most powerful families in this county. If we're going to move against them, we need more than rumors and missing paperwork. We need hard evidence." Shaq leaned in, his voice low but firm. "You think this is about paperwork?" Jasper was scared for his life, Sheriff. He told people someone was after him. He rewrote his will because he knew what was coming. Stratton held up a placating hand. "Shaq, I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm saying my hands are tied without something concrete." Shaq sat back slowly, the muscles in his jaw working as he forced himself to stay calm. It wasn't just bureaucracy. He could feel it. The weight of old alliances, of quiet pressures, of unspoken boundaries. Stratton might have been sympathetic, but he wasn't willing to take on the Westfield name, not without risking his position, his reputation, maybe his own safety. Beneath the sheriff's careful words, Shaq heard the undertones he'd encountered his whole life. "Don't stir things up. Stay in your lane. You're just a visitor here, no matter how big your name, no matter how much you think you know." He stood slowly, gathering the papers, his voice controlled but edged with steel. Thanks for your time, Sheriff. Stratton rose too, offering a faint, regretful smile. Take care of yourself, Shaq. As Shaq stepped out into the cool morning air, frustration burned low in his chest. He pulled in a breath, scanning the sleepy town square, the coffee shop with its regulars clustered by the window, the hardware store opening for the day, the courthouse steps gleaming in the sun, all the places Jasper's family name reached, all the corners where influence ran quiet but deep. He knew better than to expect a sudden breakthrough from the law. Systems like these didn't break for outsiders, no matter how loudly they knocked. If he wanted to make noise, he needed to go elsewhere. That afternoon, Shaq found himself back on the streets, making calls, shaking hands, quietly pulling the community into his orbit. He started with Marla Jennings, a sharp-tongued reporter for the local paper, someone who'd covered the Westfields for years but had never been afraid to jab at their glossy surface. Marla sat across from him at a corner booth in the diner, her dark eyes sharp behind her glasses, her pen already scribbling notes. So you're telling me Silas Westfield may have orchestrated his own brother's death and buried the will that would have cut him out? Shaq nodded, voice steady. I can't prove everything yet, but I can tell you the sheriff isn't touching it, and Claire's about to get steamrolled. Marla let out a low whistle. That's the kind of headline they don't want printed. That's exactly why we need it printed, Shaq said quietly. Marla gave him a long, assessing look. You're sure you want to go public with this? Once this runs, you're not just poking the bear, you're ripping off the front door. Shaq's gaze didn't waver. They're counting on silence. I'm not giving it to them. Word spread faster than Shaq expected. Within 2 days, whispers were floating through the community. Not just about the Westfield family, but about the outsider, the basketball legend, the man who was daring to pull at the threads no one else touched. Some people cheered him on quietly. Others shot him wary glances, their loyalty to the old power too ingrained to shake loose. But the noise was growing. At Clara's house, Shaq stood with her at the kitchen window, watching as a small crowd gathered outside. Neighbors, reporters, curious locals. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, her voice trembling. I didn't want it to turn into this. Shaq rested a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. You didn't turn it into this. They did. We're just making sure people see it. Clara let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can stand in front of all this, Shaq. He turned her gently, his voice low and firm. Yes, you can, because you're not standing alone. The next morning, Shaq found himself standing outside the courthouse, the town's eyes on him, as reporters thrust microphones forward, cameras flickering. Clara stood beside him, pale but upright, her chin lifted slightly. Shaq spoke clearly, steadily, laying out the evidence. The missing will, the suspicious circumstances of Jasper's death. He called for an independent investigation. He called for accountability. But more than that, he called out the silence. The way institutions looked away when power pressed too hard. The way justice bent for the rich while the rest were told to stay quiet. As the crowd buzzed, Shaq felt the pushback coming. The cold glances from familiar faces, the tight-lipped warnings, the quiet words meant to scare him off. But he stood firm. He wasn't just fighting for Clara. He was fighting against the unspoken rules that had let families like the Westfields stay untouchable for generations. That night, as the headlines rolled out and the community's pulse quickened, Shaq sat alone on his porch, the phone buzzing non-stop beside him. He let it ring. He needed the quiet just for a moment to remind himself why he was doing this. He thought of Jasper, his laugh on the golf course, the way he'd spoken about love, about change, about wanting to do better. He thought of Clara, her grief, her resilience, her fragile hope that truth might still count for something. And he thought of every door that had been quietly closed in his face, every warning glance, every time he'd been told to back off. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. They didn't know Shaq very well. He didn't back off. The old Westfield Estate's grand hall was packed, its high ceilings echoing with the low hum of whispered conversations, nervous coughs, and the occasional clink of polished shoes on marble. Shaq stood near the back, his broad shoulders almost brushing the ornate molding, arms crossed as his eyes swept the room. He saw the polished wood, the gold-framed paintings, the heavy velvet curtains, every inch of it a reminder of the Westfield name, its power, its reach. And in the center of it all sat Silas Westfield, his expression cool, composed, almost smug as he waited for the lawyer to begin reading the will he believed would crown him master of it all. Clara sat 2 rows ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, shoulders stiff, eyes forward but distant. Shaq could see the tension in the set of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped each other, until her knuckles went white. She was ready, but she was scared. He couldn't blame her. Benjamin Hawthorne, the family lawyer, cleared his throat, tapping a thin stack of papers neatly on the table. Thank you all for gathering today. We are here to officially read the last will and testament of Jasper Westfield. The room quieted instantly, eyes turning forward, breaths holding. Silas leaned back in his chair, his lips twitching faintly at the corners. Shaq could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone, the hush before the storm. But he wasn't here to let Silas have his moment. As Hawthorne began to read, Shaq stepped forward. Quietly, deliberately, but with the kind of presence that made heads turn before he even spoke. Hawthorne paused, frowning slightly. I'm sorry, Shaq, the lawyer murmured. This isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Shaq said, his voice low but carrying clearly through the hall. All eyes swung to him. Shaq took another step forward, holding up a thick envelope in one large hand. Before you finish, I think you'll want to read the real will. A ripple of shocked murmurs swept the room. Silas sat up sharply, his eyes narrowing, his face draining of color before he forced on a tight, strained smile. What is this nonsense? Shaq met his gaze evenly. It's the will Jasper signed 3 weeks before he died. The one you thought you'd buried. But see, you underestimated a lot of people. Jasper, Clara, and me. Benjamin took the envelope, frowning as he carefully opened it, scanning the pages inside, his brow furrowed deeper with every line he read, his mouth tightening at the corners. Finally, he looked up, his voice calm but edged with steel. This document is signed, notarized, and legally binding. It supersedes the version I was about to read. Clara let out a soft, shaky breath, tears pricking her eyes. Silas shot to his feet, his chair scraping sharply against the polished floor. This is a setup, he barked, his voice cracking at the edges. That woman, she's manipulating all of you. She's been scheming for this for years. Clara rose slowly, turning to face him. Her voice trembled slightly, but the words came out clear, cutting. You think I wanted any of this? Jasper was your brother, Silas. He loved you, he trusted you, and you spent every second resenting him, resenting us. Silas's face darkened, his fists tightening at his sides. You think anyone's going to believe you over me? Over this family? Shaq stepped forward, his deep voice steady, calm, unshakable. They already do. The room shifted, the balance of power tilting visibly. Guests glanced uneasily between Silas and Shaq, between Clara and Hawthorne, the old social rules starting to crumble under the weight of truth laid bare. For a moment Silas stood frozen, his mouth working as if searching for a defense, a rebuttal, but none came. Clara's voice softened. Jasper tried to warn me. He left everything to me not out of spite, but because he knew what you were capable of. And now everyone else knows too. Silas gave a low, bitter laugh. You think you're going to win? You think this is over? Shaq took a slow step forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow across Silas's smaller, wire figure. No, Shaq said quietly. But it's the beginning of the end for you. The lawyer cleared his throat again, his voice calm but firm. We will proceed with the correct will. Mr. Silas Westfield has no claim to the estate. Silas's mouth twisted, a sharp retort on the tip of his tongue. But he caught himself, his eyes darting to the watching crowd, to the reporter slipping quietly into the back, notebooks ready. Slowly, stiffly, he adjusted his jacket, shooting Clara one last venomous glance before turning on his heel and striding out of the room. His footsteps echoed sharply in the heavy silence. For a long suspended moment, no one spoke. Then Clara let out a shaky half-laugh, half-sob, sinking back into her chair, her hands trembling against her lap. Shaq stepped quickly to her side, resting a steadying hand on her shoulder. You did it, she whispered, her voice breaking. We did it. Shaq smiled faintly, a warmth flickering in his chest despite the exhaustion pulling at his bones. You were stronger than you thought. Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining with a complex mix of relief, grief, and something like gratitude. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Shaq shook his head gently. You didn't need me to save you, Clara. You just needed someone to stand beside you while you saved yourself. Around them, the room slowly began to stir again. People rising, conversations resuming in hushed tones, the weight of the confrontation still hanging heavy, but beginning to lift. Clara rose unsteadily to her feet, and Shaq offered his arm without hesitation. She took it, grounding herself as they moved through the hall together. As they stepped outside, the cool air hit Shaq's face, sharp and clean. He drew in a deep breath, feeling the knot of tension in his chest begin to loosen, for the first time in weeks. Clara stood beside him, looking up at the vast stretch of sky, her expression tired but peaceful. "I don't know what happens next," she murmured. Shaq gave a small, thoughtful nod. "None of us ever do." For a long, quiet moment, they stood there together, two people who had walked through grief, betrayal, and redemption, not unscathed, but unbroken. Shaq felt the weight of Jasper's absence, the ghost of his friend lingering in the air, but also the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had honored him, fought for him, refused to let his memory be twisted or erased. As Clara squeezed his arm gently, Shaq smiled faintly, his voice low. "Come on, let's go home." And together they stepped forward, leaving the shadows of the past behind them. The sun was just beginning to lift over the horizon, casting a pale gold glow across the lawn, as Clara stepped quietly onto the porch. Shaq sat there, his massive figure hunched slightly forward on the wooden steps, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on the street ahead. He hadn't slept, not really. There had been too much on his mind, too much weight on his shoulders. Even after the final confrontation at the estate, he was still processing it all. The will, the exposure, Silas's fall from power, the quiet but undeniable shift in the town's gaze toward Clara. She approached softly, a folded piece of paper clutched in her hands. Shaq heard her coming but didn't turn, simply offering a faint, tired smile. "Morning." Clara sat down beside him, pulling her knees up slightly, tucking them under the hem of her light sweater. "I found something last night," she said quietly, her voice raw from the emotion that had carried them both through the last few days. Shaq glanced at her, brow furrowing slightly. "It was in Jasper's old desk," Clara continued, offering him the letter. "Addressed to you." Shaq hesitated, his large hands gently taking the paper. The envelope was thick, slightly yellowed, Jasper's handwriting unmistakable on the front. His name, written plainly, no formalities, no flourishes, just with slow, deliberate care, Shaq opened it, unfolding the letter inside. The words blurred slightly as his tired eyes traced the lines, his chest tightening with every sentence. "Shaq, if you're reading this, something has happened. And I need you to know one thing above everything else. You are the best man I know. You always were. You never saw me as Jasper the heir, Jasper the rich kid, Jasper the man with the legacy to uphold. You saw me the flaws, the doubts, the man trying to make sense of the world he was born into, and you still stood by me. I know I've put you in an impossible position. I know if anyone tries to set things right after I'm gone, it'll be you. You don't owe me that, Shaq. You never did. But if you do fight for Clara, for what's right, know that I am grateful. Know that I believed in you as a man, not as a celebrity, not as a name, but as someone who lives with heart and truth and strength. Take care of her, if you can. Take care of yourself too. I love you, brother." Shaq swallowed hard, blinking quickly as he folded the letter again, his hands shaking slightly. For a long, quiet moment, he just sat there staring down at the paper resting in his lap, feeling the familiar burn of tears pressing at the back of his eyes. Clara's voice broke gently through the stillness. "He really did love you, you know." Shaq gave a small, breathless laugh, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Yeah, I know." They sat in silence, the weight of everything they'd been through settling slowly over them like dust, not crushing, but undeniable. Clara reached over, resting her hand lightly on Shaq's massive forearm. "I don't know how I would have made it through any of this without you." Shaq shook his head gently, his voice low. "You made it through because you're stronger than you think." She smiled faintly, her eyes glassy but warm. "So what happens now?" Shaq leaned back slightly, tilting his head toward the brightening sky. "Now you rebuild. You take what's yours, you make it your own, and you let the rest fall away." Clara's gaze softened. "And you?" Shaq let out a slow exhale, a faint, thoughtful smile playing at his lips. "I'll keep moving. I've got people to look out for, places to be, things to fix." They both knew the truth behind his words. Shaq wasn't just walking away because his job here was done. He was walking away because that's who he was. Someone who stepped in when he was needed. Someone who didn't chase recognition, who didn't need a title or a legacy. He carried his worth in how he showed up, in how he stood firm when it mattered, in the quiet, unshakable loyalty that had defined him long before the world called him Big Shaq. As the sun climbed higher, Shaq stood, stretching his arms wide, feeling the tension pull and crack in his shoulders. Clara rose too, watching him with a bittersweet expression. "Promise me you'll stay in touch," she murmured. Shaq smiled gently, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You'll hear from me." He turned toward the street, walking slowly down the path, his broad figure cutting a familiar silhouette against the light. Clara stood at the porch watching him go, feeling the strange ache of farewell mixed with the quiet, grateful knowledge that they had come through the storm. Scarred perhaps, but not defeated. Shaq reached his car, pausing for a moment to glance back. He lifted a hand in a small wave, then slipped inside, the engine humming to life as he pulled away. The road stretched out ahead, long and open, lined with trees and early sunlight, the world waiting. Inside the car, Shaq rested the letter on the passenger seat, his hand brushing it lightly as he drove. His mind drifted over everything: the racism they'd faced, the betrayals they'd uncovered, the victories they'd earned, and the losses they still carried. He felt the weight of it all settle into him, not as a burden, but as part of who he was now, a man who had stood in the middle of a storm and refused to back down. He smiled faintly, a soft, private curve of his lips as the morning light washed over him. This wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about headlines or court victories or family drama. It was about justice. And Shaq knew, deep in his bones, that he would always stand for that, wherever it was needed, whatever it cost. As the sun rose fully over the horizon, bathing the road ahead in gold, Shaq drove on, carrying with him the quiet, powerful weight of having done the right thing, the hard thing, the necessary thing. Not as a celebrity, not as a hero, but as a man who simply chose to stand when others looked away. And that, he knew, was the real victory, the one that mattered most. If this story gripped you, don't let the questions stop here. Dive deeper into the truths families hide, and the strength it takes to stand up. Every betrayal, every injustice, every buried secret leaves echoes waiting to be uncovered. Stay connected to the stories that challenge, provoke, and remind us what loyalty and courage really mean. There's always another layer, another twist, another reckoning, just beyond the surface, and we're here to pull it into the light.